All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone to this afternoon's webinar, Protect Your Brand During Layoffs, Secrets to a Smooth Transition. My name is Raymond Lee. I'm the president of Career Minds and the sponsor of today's webinar. So I'm seeing lots of people here who are from everywhere, New York and Texas, Tanzania, which is pretty interesting. So a nice little mix of folks coming in from different parts of the world. So welcome everyone as you're coming in. Yeah, please share where you're dialing in from today, and really appreciate you carving out some time here for today's session. All right, well, I'm going to hop right in. And first, I want to kick things off by first saying that we all recognize that layoffs are incredibly stressful to all involved, whether you're on the call working in HR, employees impacted, managers, leaders of a company. Layoffs are incredibly tough. And while we'll spend a little bit of time here today sharing ideas on ways that you can protect your brand in terms of staying out of the press, out of the media, making sure that how your employees see the company conducting layoffs in a very tough time is really important. I want to focus kind of like on the internal and external aspects of your brand. So not only how people are visualizing and seeing what's happening out externally in the media, but then also how your employees are seeing how you're handling the layoffs internally. So we're going to focus on that. And then we're also going to focus on avoiding a layoff. So we're going to spend a good bit of time on the involuntary aspects of planning a layoff, but even more importantly, what are things that we can do as leaders to avoid having an involuntary layoff? And I want to share this comment or this quote by Simon Sinek that says, hire slow and fire never, or almost never. And I think this is a really good goal to have because obviously having to lay off employees is not fun. And when I think about 2022 and 2023, in 22, a lot of tech companies were on a hiring frenzy. And then early part of 23, I think we all saw that in the tech sector, there were layoffs happening across large tech companies, small tech companies. Google, Twitter, Facebook had significant layoffs, as well as others in the tech sector. And a lot of what we heard from leaders is that they were hiring at a rapid pace to keep up with the scale and growth of the company. But as you hit that inflection point, that plateau, as things slow down, you find yourself having to reduce staff. And I'm actually going to share today the case study, I'm going to call it, with Peloton, which I think is a perfect storm of this example, where after COVID, everyone was running out and getting a Peloton. They were isolated in their homes, and Peloton in 2020 through 2022 had incredible growth to the point where they had to, lay off almost half the company. And so I'm going to reference Peloton a couple of times here because I believe that, they're sort of an example where they had to hire fast, and then it caught up with them over time. So 3 alternatives to layoffs that I'm going to speak to today. Number 1 is outskilling, which to some of you may be a new term, to reskilling and upskilling. I want to talk a little bit about voluntary layoffs as an option or alternative, as well as phased retirements, which is something that's getting more and more popular, particularly with the baby boomer generation who are retiring. I think there was a statistic that I read that over 7,000 baby boomers are retiring every day, and that's going to continue over the next few years. And then finally, we'll wrap up with involuntary layoffs as sort of some best practices and tips. A lot of these, by the way, are going to be a reminder to you in terms of some of the things that you should be thinking about if you have to get to the point where, the involuntary layoff is needed. And I want to say one other thing to this alternatives is that these three options, the outskilling, the voluntary, and the phased retirements, these are things that you should start doing today so that they're in place, so that when you have layoffs down the road, potentially, if there's a mass layoff, these are programs that are already established. So if you have a large event coming and you're going to have to cut a certain percentage of the workforce, and they're all going to be involuntary, putting programs like the outskilling and phased retirement into place, you probably won't have enough time to do that. And so these alternatives you have to really think about are programs that you're going to put in place today that you could potentially use at a future time. So let's talk about the idea of outskilling. And before I hop into these suggestions, if you have any questions, I probably should have said this on the outset. We activated the chat for everyone. So if you hit the chat feature, you can post questions, and I'll be monitoring this throughout the session. So if you have any questions at any point, feel free to post them in the chat. And then obviously at the end, I'll certainly take some questions toward the end of the session. Okay, so with outskilling, you've heard the World Economic Forum, McKinsey, who said due to digital transformation and the expansion to hybrid and remote work, there's over 70 million jobs that are going to be let go in the next decade. And at the same time, there's over 80 million jobs that are going to be created. And so there's this big transformation that's occurring, and outskilling is almost like outplacement. But the difference here is that what you're doing is you're taking employees who are impacted by AI or any sort of automation that's occurring in your industry. These employees may not necessarily have the skills for contributing going forward, but outskilling provides a vehicle to get them skilled in other areas. And so when you think about outskilling, you're training workers for skills that are outside of their current role. So if you have employees that are in data entry roles or manual jobs, and they're not eligible, or you're not able to upskill them and reskill them into other positions, but they're going to be impacted by a reduction in force, these could be great people for outskilling. And so at the end, you're technically going to be riffing the employee, but you're going to be providing them with them support for them to get skilled in other capacities. And a company that's doing this really well is a company called Future Fit AI. And the example here that I'm sharing with Future Fit is 200 tellers who were impacted due to automation. And this particular bank that had to reduce tellers across the country, they worked with Future Fit to identify an outskilling program that was geared towards cybersecurity. And so they were able to train these 200 tellers on cybersecurity, and then essentially they were reduced by the company, but then they were deployed with these new skills into this new position. And this is going to be a trend that you're going to see as an option that you could potentially help employees that are impacted with outskilling into new jobs. Another alternative is the voluntary layoff. And what I like to say about voluntary, while it sounds great in theory, it's not necessarily applicable to every company and every use case. So voluntary essentially is the opposite of involuntary. Employees are volunteering to be laid off. And so in your company, you have to identify whether this could be a good practice. Essentially, the outcome is the same. So the end result is you have to cut your budget, you have to eliminate a certain number of headcount in a certain region or a certain business unit. But instead of involuntarily separating people, you're providing a program where you're soliciting volunteers to raise their hand and volunteer to be laid off. And so the outcome's the same. And the benefit of a voluntary situation is that it creates really good morale within the company. So it's obviously a lot more beneficial. It's a lot easier when someone volunteers to be laid off than when you're forcing them to leave the company. And again, this is a program that you want to establish ahead of time. You want to have it in place. And there are some structural components of a voluntary layoff program that you should take in consideration as you're creating your voluntary separation program. And so it's, upfront, you have to establish the program. One key component is creating an incentive for people to volunteer. You don't really want to just rely on what they would get in severance or even outplacement or career transition. You want to create a program that incentivizes them to take a package. And this could be providing them with an extra month of severance. So let's say their severance package, if they were involuntarily separated, would be, let's say 2 weeks every year is your company severance, kind of program. And let's say it maxes out to a year. Well, if you offer a voluntary severance kind of package, you may decide that if you offer a voluntary separation to, let's say, 1,000 employees across your company, and the goal is to try to get to 800 employees, you may decide that you want to provide them with an extra month of severance on top of what they would get if they were involuntarily separated. And so the communication that you would send out to employees is that in an effort to right-size the company, which is the outcome that you're desiring, what you want to do is create an incentive for volunteers to come forward, and then they'll evaluate the severance package. And what they're sort of thinking about and deciding about is whether, do I want to take a richer package today, or do I want to kind of roll the dice and, potentially get involuntarily separated, maybe a month later. And so you want to provide a timeline in order for the person to make their decision. So, let's just say we're at the end of March and that you have to reduce headcount in June. You can put a program in place, send it out to all the employees who are eligible for the voluntary separation program, and then you're giving them 3 weeks to decide. And part of that communication, they know that there is an involuntary separation that could be coming. The company has to reduce so much cost, so much headcount. And then if you get to that point where you have enough people who volunteer, then you're going to avoid an involuntary separation. And employees have to understand that, right? Like the employees have to understand that there is a number that you have to get to. And so each person is going to evaluate the severance package and decide whether or not it makes sense for them to volunteer. And we have a lot of experience in doing this with some of our clients. Well, I know several of you all are on the call here today. Companies that I've worked with in the past, where we've used this as a strategy to minimize the involuntary layoffs. And every person sort of thinks about their own unique scenario. People are smart, they know where there's automation happening. They see where, maybe certain business units are a lot more, profitable than others. They can, they go to the town halls, they listen to the president or CEO of your company, and they hear what's happening. They can see the writing on the wall of whether or not they'll be impacted or not. And you'd be surprised at how many people do raise their hand and say, you know what, I'm going to take the severance package and take the extra month or whatever the company decides that they want to provide to the employees as the incentive. Oftentimes, the question that I get is, what if someone volunteers and I don't want them to volunteer? I'm going to touch on that in just a second. This case study I just want to share really quick here is Boeing, and this is online, by the way. There's I think the Harvard Business Review or someone looked at Boeing as a best practice in conducting a voluntary layoff. So if you type in Boeing and voluntary layoff, you should find it. This goes back a couple of years, but I'm sharing this for two reasons. One is it's obviously a big brand; they're global, and they had to lay off a significant number of employees, over 1,800 employees that they offered it to. They ended up getting 1,500-ish workers who volunteered to leave the company. They were able to reduce costs, but they maintained morale of the company in terms of the company went the extra mile to protect their brand, but also protect the culture of the company in terms of the feelings, the emotions that people feel when you're impacting over 1,500 people. And so I say kudos to companies like Boeing who go that extra mile. So two watchouts, I would say, in terms of I would say legal watchouts here, is you can't single anyone out. You can't go to a handful of people and say, hey, we want you to volunteer, and not others. So you have to consistently apply it to a whole department or a whole company. You can't single anyone out and say, we want you to take the voluntary separation. It has to be voluntary. And so if you, this QR code here, by the way, is if you're interested in getting some more information, a checklist of this, we have some resources that you can download. So feel free to do that. I see someone just, oh, okay, we just posted the URL in there for you if you want to take a look at that. All right. I feel like there was one other thing I wanted to say on the so something that I did want to just mention here as it relates to singling anyone out. What I have seen done is if there's an employee who's critical to the business, they could be in a management position, leadership position, key role, and you really don't want them to take it, you can loosely have conversations with people. So if there's an employee and they come to the manager and they say, hey, I saw this voluntary separation package, and should I take that? No, you could say, no, we don't want you to take it. We want you to stay. And you could certainly tell them, privately that you really want them to stay and things are well and all that kind of stuff. So having one-on-one conversations with people as they ask questions, I think it's appropriate to do that. Just be careful about, what you're sharing as part of, advice that you're giving. Okay, so let's shift gears and talk about phased retirement. As I mentioned earlier, phased retirement's getting more popular today just because there are a lot of companies who need to make changes. And depending on the industry that you're in, whether you're in higher education or insurance or maybe even manufacturing, you could have a long tenured workforce and a number of employees who could be part of your RIF are employees who are over the age of 55. Could be early retirement, could be employees that are in their 60s. And so the idea of a phased retirement is, again, putting a program in place that helps employees gradually exit. And the program essentially gives employees the opportunity to raise their hand ahead of time, could be 6 months before retirement, a year before retirement. And what you do is you're creating a schedule for them that allows them to reduce their workload over a period of time. And a company that I'd like to share, several years ago, we worked with in Pennsylvania, Kennametal's a manufacturing company. They instituted a phased retirement program that they offer to their employees. And it's a program that's documented. It's in their benefits plan. It was communicated to all employees. And there's certain criteria that they establish, years of service, age, all of those things. And it's offered to everyone. Again, you can't single anyone out. And the employee has the opportunity, they can get into the program. Part of the program is reducing, their hours over the course of a year. And the benefit of this is supporting knowledge transfer. And so while, you may not necessarily reduce an entire headcount, if you have a handful of people who go into the phased retirement program, you can allow that person to transition out of the company over a period of time. They can also mentor new employees that you hire back in. So again, it's a great way to increase morale, employer brand, and so we definitely consider checking out phased retirement as an option. Okay, so we're going to transition here and hop into the last, which is the involuntary. It's the part that's not fun. Let's say you've exhausted all of your efforts, and the outskilling, the voluntary, the phased retirement, those are not options, and you're in a position where the leadership and the company, um, you know, goes to HR, and you're working together, and you have to cut a certain percentage of your company. Well, obviously, involuntary layoffs really impact a company's culture overall. And there's a couple of things here that I think it's important to keep in mind is you want to minimize this as much as possible. And some things to think about is the number of layoffs that you're likely to conduct over a period of time. Some of these things you just can't avoid. And so, I think back over, I don't know, 20 years ago, in the early 2000s, I was working for Corning out of Corning, New York, and this was around the dot-com bubble, and I felt like, the years that I was there, it was like every 6 months there was a layoff that was happening, and just when you get to the point where you feel like, okay, it's over, and you're back working and you're focused on the future of the company, all of a sudden there's another town hall, or there's another layoff coming. And I'm sure there's a lot of people on the call here today who can relate to that. It's never fun. It's the part of HR that I think everyone dislikes, but it really impacts your culture. And I think to the extent you can make your cut, in one event, and recognize what is the outcome that we need to achieve in terms of what does the company need to look like. I think that it just really minimizes the disruption and allows employees to refocus on the future. So if you can do that one time versus a layoff like every quarter over the course of a year, overall, I think it's going to help your company in terms of staying focused on productivity in the future. This is a graphic I like to share because depending on the size of the event, whether you're having to impact 5 people or 5,000 people, the larger the event, the more exposure, and the risk of lawsuits and negative press increases. And so I mentioned some of the bigger companies earlier, Google and Twitter, last year, and even a couple of years ago, companies that are impacting in the thousands of employees. Lack of planning, communication, the logistical planning behind it creates risk in terms of impacting your brand. You'll end up in the media. Your Glassdoor ratings will take a hit. Employee morale will take a hit. And so the bigger the event, the attention to detail is that much more critical. So we're going to talk about 3 areas here around the notification process for reductions in force. One is the planning, second is delivering the message, and then finally we're going to touch on responding to common reactions that occur. So in terms of the selection guide, and as far as identifying who you should select to be impacted, there's 5 examples here, from seniority, employee status, merit, skills. There could be multiple criteria. Sticking to the Peloton example, you have to, if you're impacting a significant population of your company, could be related to skills. It could be a little bit of seniority and skills, but you have to sort of identify what is the outcome? What does the organization need to look like in order to continue forward? And it's almost like you taking an org chart today. You have your org chart of the company today, and then you're creating a new org chart. And it doesn't even have people on it. It's just positions. So you're taking the people out of it, and you have your org chart with the structure of the company and the roles on the org chart of today. And then you're now saying, okay, based on our revenues, based on our size, the business, what does the org chart need to look like today? And obviously it's going to be a lot smaller. And then you create that infrastructure of what is needed today. And then from that perspective, you're creating your selection criteria, and then you're identifying, who are in those positions. It could be based on skill selection. It could be based on merit. It could be based on seniority. Could be a number of criteria, but you're making your decisions of what the organization is going to look like based on the roles that you need, the jobs that you need going forward, and then you're identifying who are the right people in those jobs, depending on this criteria here. I would say that's the most common approach that is taken. But then, there's obviously, if you're moving the customer support team to India, or there's a whole new technology that's coming in and everyone's getting impacted. Well, then it's really it's kind of built based on skills, or it's based on a specific criteria that's impacting everyone. And so there are other factors that I think are going to be considered when you're thinking about those decisions. All right, I'm intentionally pausing here. I just want to see if there are any questions. Again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to use them in the chat. If you want to post a comment and say, hey, this sounds great, this is really helpful, that would be good as well. A little positive reinforcement there. I appreciate that. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about delivering layoffs with compassion. And I sometimes think that this is, I think we have the best intention to treat people with dignity and respect, but we're all so busy and there's a lot going on. And I think while we have the best intention, if we're not spending the right amount of time thinking about all the details related to the process of how people are being notified and how people are being exited and the message that we're delivering, if we're not giving that the right amount of attention, then the unintended consequence of that is people feeling like you don't care, or you just didn't really pay attention to their feelings. And so this whole idea of delivering layoffs with compassion is intentional. You have to really think about what's the process look like, and how do you want to communicate to individuals, because this is going to have such a huge impact on your brand. This will lead to the tweet, tagging your company, and enough of those tweets are recognized by the media. Well, then you're going to end up on a digital Wall Street Journal or the Huffington Post or something like that, and you obviously want to avoid that. And if you're intentional about the employee and the dignity and respect component of that, I think the outcome of that is you're going to avoid a lot of the negative branding things that are associated with lack of planning, lack of preparation. All right, thank you for that, Kim. I appreciate that. I had a question: can companies use algorithms to determine the population of the risk? That is a good question. So when you say algorithms, I think of machine learning and AI. And the thing that that pops in my head right away is bias. And there's a lot of great companies out there that's creating algorithms and machine learning and AI to to help make decisions for us and make suggestions, and also to avoid bias. I think that I'd be really, really careful about using algorithms. I think it could be good, but you also need to make sure that you're scrubbing the data and accounting for bias as well, because that's obviously a big component of the selection component of who's going to be impacted. All right. So a little bit of a refresher here. This kind of structure of the meeting can be used both virtually or in person. So if you're meeting face to face, or if you're meeting virtually, this process has stood the test of time in terms of meeting with the individual. I always recommend a one-on-one meeting is to the best that you can meet one-on-one. I think if there's a small team that's being impacted, if you're pulling them into a conference room or you're getting on a group meeting together, I think that's appropriate. Oftentimes get the question, is it appropriate to meet as a group? I would say try to meet as a manageable group versus, bringing hundreds of people on to a webcast where you're letting people know that they leave. A lot of times that gets in the public media and can tarnish your brand. So I would say one-on-one meeting. And the other component that I would just say is a watch out for the virtual meetings is, people are working from home and there's life that's happening. Their kid could be home from sick, or their kid could be homesick. They could be taking care of an elderly person or family member. They're not in the office. And so if you're doing involuntary meetings and you're meeting with people and they're hopping onto a virtual meeting and they're meeting with you, the manager, or the HR person and the manager, you're likely surprising them, and they could be sitting at their kitchen table and they could have family members around. And so I would just be mindful of that and in those scenarios. But definitely recommend the one-on-one meeting and having HR in the room. We're going to talk about the decision here in just a bit in terms of the message, but transitioning that meeting to where HR takes over and goes into the severance benefits, transition packet info, exiting, and then bringing in EAP and any other support that's needed. So kind of keeping this at a high level. I had a question here from Dana regarding communication. At what point should you tell the whole company of an impending restructure? Dana, that's a really good question. So let's say if it's an involuntary, what I've seen is if there's, to the extent you could be transparent with people, I would say, you're going to share it maybe the day before that there are going to be meetings, and if there are people on site or you're going to be having meetings with individuals over the course of one day, I think it's beneficial that the CEO of the company or the business leader or business unit leader can send out an email that says that changes are going to happen over the next day or the next 2 days. There's going to be meetings that are occurring. And even to take it a step back for a second, Dana, I also think it's important that, as a whole, the leadership of the company should be communicating the health of the business anyway, whether you're publicly traded or privately held. Having town halls and sharing financials or whatever is comfortable, letting employees know that, what's happening in our business and where are we with market share and things like that. And so I think in general, communicating the health of the business is important, because when you get to the point of having to make separations, whether there's an acquisition or divestiture, all those kind of things, there shouldn't be any surprises. And so if the CEO of the company or a business unit leader sends out an email 24 hours ahead of time and says, as I've said in previous town halls, due to this, this, and this, we're going to have to make some changes over the next day. We're going to be having some meetings. Again, this is the involuntary situation. There'll be some meetings that are going to be occurring. And so you're giving people a heads up and you're saying, be respectful, please, to your fellow coworkers. And this is a tough time for us. People are going to be notified. And then you have your meetings, whether it's a meeting letting someone know that they're either in the same position, maybe in a different position. There are other meetings that are happening where the employee may be impacted. And so there's a transition. So I do feel like if you let people know ahead of time, they already are starting to process that something's going to be coming. They're thinking about, hey, if I am impacted, I'm going to do this, or I'm thinking about this. So I feel like that helps with the, I think that's helpful to do that. That's very long-winded, Dana, to your question, but hopefully that answers what you were looking for. So delivering the message, you're welcome. So the thing I'm gonna focus on here is really just around the setting of the stage and providing the business case. It's so important that the managers and the supervisors and the leaders are providing a consistent message across the board. And this is where we see so many issues that come out of this, where employees share notes the next day, the next 2 days, they call their friend and they say, what did your manager say to you? And the message is completely different. And so this preparation on delivering the message, making sure that the leaders are prepared in what they're going to say, it should be short and sweet, and it should be very specific. As you've heard, CEO or president or business unit leader talked about these things. As a result, we've had to make some cuts, and your position is being eliminated. And that's it. And so you want to make sure that your managers are consistently delivering the business case across the board. There may be some unique circumstances where the message is a little bit different, depending on maybe the business unit or there could be some other factors, but you don't want your managers going rogue and saying other things that are unrelated to the reason, because that will only get you into some situations. We will be providing a recording, Mary, to the presentation as well as the slides. So we'll be sending those out to everyone afterwards. So the other part to the message that I think is really important that you give space to is listening and responding to employees with empathy. And so once you deliver the message, they're going to internalize what they're hearing from you as far as the reason, and they're going to internalize the fact that they were impacted. And so it's important to pause. You want to give them kind of the opportunity to hear you, and then respond with empathy. And so in this particular example, you're kind of reading back to them or saying back to them that it looks like they're surprised. And then you're reinforcing the fact that, I think it's okay to say this is, companies had to make some tough decisions as a result of the finances or other things that we talked about. But we're here to say that we're going to provide you with severance and support, and would like to share details about that if you're ready. And the idea here is to try to get them to say, yeah, I'd like to hear more about how you're going to help me as a company. So here are, and this is actually really helpful as a handout. So we won't go through this, but this is just a great sort of guide on coaching managers on how to handle employee reactions. And what's interesting is that the employee that you think is going to be angry and hostile generally is not angry and hostile. And the employee who you think is going to be stoic and quiet are the ones that blow up and are argumentative and asking why me. And so, you have the employee reaction across the top. You have a description of the underlying feelings and emotions that the employee is displaying. So if they're angry, they're hurt, they're disappointed, they're rejected, And then here are the suggestions for your manager to offer. So if you're angry, the manager should stay calm, they should listen. You can even allow the employees to vent, but you don't want to argue with them. So those are some suggestions. And again, we'll be sending this out. And if you have a new manager who's having to do this for the first time, this is a great tool for you to use to prepare them for, what's possible. Okay, so I had a comment here, communicate with care, compassion, and competence. Cannot emphasize the human empathy component enough, as well as follow up in check-ins. Yeah, that's a great comment here. The follow-up, check-ins, being, compassionate, emphasizing the human element here. So thank you for that comment. So this is an example checklist. Checklist for large events is critical. And here's a sample that we took from a company who had a large event. They had a command center, which was an HR administrator who was in, their workday system. They had a big spreadsheet with multiple tabs. And at the end of every notification, the HR person would call this one person who was command central, and they would say this, this person was just notified, and then they would actually keep in their meeting a list of FAQs, and they would also keep a list of issues that came up, questions or any issues that were mentioned. They wouldn't necessarily say them, to the command center. By the way, it may not be a phone call. It could be, a message or a Slack or something like that. But you're just messaging whoever this person is. They're keeping track that all the notifications are happening across the country, across the globe. And why this is important, especially for a large event, is you want to make sure that if someone calls out sick or they don't show up or log into their, their Google Meet or their Zoom call or didn't show up in the office, you want to make sure of anyone that had been accounted for needs to be notified. You don't want to shut off a badge if they weren't notified. So a command center is a great way to stay organized. You definitely, for those virtual employees, you want to confirm their email address and phone number. So if you're sending FedEx, their severance package to them, you want to make sure that you have that, even their home address, confirm all of that information. And then anything internally that you have to deactivate, here are some examples that are pretty common when it comes to your notification checklist. And then anything that needs to be coordinated after the fact, whether someone has to come into the office, all these components are part of the checklist. You could have a 50-item checklist that you're accounting for. Here's just some examples that you want to consider. And again, it's important to keep FAQs. So as your meetings are happening, you're going to have a number of questions that come up. And I think it's a best practice for you to publish the FAQs to everyone who's impacted. Now, in this case, you may not necessarily want to say why this is happening, but if it's not clear, I think just saying overall, why the layoff occurred. Actually, now when I think about this isn't something that your FAQs about benefits. So these are questions that could come up that employees may be asking. So my apologies for this. This is FAQs for the employee. For you, that if they're asking in the meeting, these are best practices are answering. But you also want to have an FAQs that come out of the meetings as well. So it's a separate set of frequently asked questions that are coming up. And it could be, how do I access Cobra? Or when will I get this information? Or when can I come get my personal things? There could be a number of questions that come up from the meeting that you want to provide to employees after the event. So that's a separate set of questions. These are for you and your team to use if these questions come up as a best practice. Okay, I want to touch on what happens after the layoff. There's, sometimes this goes underestimated. And there's all kinds of articles out there that address the days shortly after the layoff. And it's probably no surprise that things like retention, productivity, engagement fall by the wayside when, when there are significant layoffs across the company. And so things like surveys, pulse surveys, there were some comments about check-ins, having, small meetup groups. So, HR plays a significant role here where within your functional groups, whether you're remote, you can bring small groups of people together on a group, kind of a virtual call. If you're in the office, you can come into a conference room. And there's, we provide some best practices around change management, and we call it future teams training. We've kind of navigated away from the survivor training, but we call it future teams training, where we're really kind of pulling people together and helping HR and managers have discussions around processing the emotions and the feelings. And it's a business decision, nothing's personal. We're doing everything we can to take care of the employees that are impacted. And then here's the plan going forward. And this is the vision of the company going forward. But taking a moment to do a check-in and asking people, how are you feeling? How are you doing? Managers need to take care of themselves. They're obviously thinking of themselves and the impact that they are experiencing as a manager, but they're also having to be there for their employees. And so it's good. It's a good practice for if you have a culture survey. We see a lot of companies will send out culture surveys to functional groups, departments, the company. If the company's small enough, you send out a survey, culture survey, and you ask specific questions around how they're feeling, comments, feedback that they have around the process, and giving them the opportunity to share their feelings goes a long way. And giving that space for employees shortly after a layoff to come together and express their feelings, talk about what it's like not to have their best friend as their coworker anymore, potentially. Spending, a couple days or a week or so just sort of going through that process will allow employees to re-engage, really focus on their productivity, and really re-engage with the vision of the company going forward. And so, don't underestimate the time that you spent with those employees that are remaining. Okay, so I wanted to, in wrapping up here, a lot of you on the call are clients of ours, so thank you so much for using Career Minds as your outplacement partner. If you are on the call and you're here learning about the topic, and you have an outplacement need, or you're thinking about your outplacement services, we've been doing this for quite a long time, for over 16 years now. And the only thing I'll say here is there's a lot that's changed in the outplacement industry in terms of delivery and service. And so if there's a need, feel free to check us out. And then the other thing I'll leave you with is we have a layoff guide. And so if you want to scan the QR code, if you're a client of ours, you don't have to scan this. Just reach out to your client success person and they'll send it to you. You probably already have it, but if you want to access it, feel free to download it. It's super comprehensive, and it has a good bit of what we covered here today, but it also has information about WARN notices and other things that I didn't touch on in today's session. You can certainly scan this code and access this information. So I'll leave this up here, and it looks like Kate also posted this in the chat, so I appreciate that, Kate. I know we have about 10 minutes left, and so if anyone has any questions or comments, if you want to post those in the chat, happy to answer any other questions that you may have. And I also love giving some time back to people's day as well. Okay, so I see that the download is in the chat, so I'm going to go to my closing slide, and I'll sit here for another minute or two. Thank you, Jess. I appreciate that. if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to stay on and answer any questions. But again, really appreciate you carving out some time today to listen in. And if you were to take any notes, I would suggest as you're listening to the recording and we're going to send out the PowerPoint presentation, consider those alternatives to a layoff, the outskilling, the voluntary, the phased retirement. Have conversations with your teams and decide whether or not that this is something that would be beneficial to you in terms of avoiding that involuntary layoff. It's certainly the best option in terms of your overall morale in the company, your company brand. All right, we do have a question from Lindsay. Any ideas on how to boost employee morale, engagement, productivity afterwards? Okay, so I'm focusing on your boost. The things that I shared is more of like the stability of, after a layoff. In terms of boosting, I think, and this really kind of depends on the culture of your company. I would say you don't want to go into any kind of celebration or anything like that, but you could have an activity. It could be you provide, managers a budget to take their employees to lunch. You could do a virtual lunch where you do a Grubhub and you give people a code and maybe you do lunch, could be a virtual happy hour or something like that, where people can come together in a very kind of light sort of social, where, you're providing lunch to people. And it could, again, be a virtual lunch. It could be, I'm thinking of events, things that are related to events, bringing people together, I think are things that kind of foster collaboration, camaraderie, things like that. But again, I'm sensitive to, like one of the things that you're gonna hear is if you spend a lot of money on having a big event, then while you have the best intention with doing something to boost morale, Lindsay, you're gonna have someone say, "Geez, you just spent $3,000 on this extravagant lunch. Why would you spend that money if times are tough?" So you have to be really careful about what you do to boost employee morale when it comes to budgets and spending money. Just trying to be kind of realistic of the pros and cons. So just be thinking about when you're trying to boost morale, don't spend too much money because people are going to be like, you just had to let all these people go and you're spending all this money. So just be sensitive to that. Okay, so we had a question I think I may have missed here, and I'm kind of scrolling back up. It looks like there was a question by someone that maybe I missed, and it says here to Makula's question, acknowledge how difficult it is, why the employee is valuable, and ways to lighten their load, demonstrate appreciation in small ways. So those are acknowledging how difficult the process is, why the employee is valuable in ways. So these are ways to, I guess this is to the previous question related to, oh, okay, I got it. That's their last name. Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. This is a ways to boost employee morale. So, right, tell them how important they are, how valuable they are. Thank you. That's a great suggestion. That doesn't cost you anything. Share your appreciation in small ways, not big ways. So thank you so much for that suggestion. I appreciate that. I'm a little slow here on the chat. So thank you. Yes, I appreciate that. Help the survivors handle the increase in their work. Yes, that's such a great comment, Rich. Obviously, there's going to be more work. Oftentimes when you're having to cut your staff, the work doesn't go away. That ends up falling on someone, and those people have to pick up. So how can you help them with their work, the workload? and being open to efficiency tools and eliminating tasks. That's a fantastic idea. I should have thought of that. Appreciate that, Rich. Really good suggestion there. All right, great comments. I appreciate that.